I think many Christians find Hebrews to be both beautiful and complicated at the same time.
Yeah,
And why do you think that that is the case? And how can we get most out of reading it?
yeah. If you think about it, New Testament books follow trajectories. So you have the narrative literature of the Gospels and Acts that start at kind of a point A and they work to point Z, they go all the way through to ending. And the epistles of Paul normally, not always exactly, but normally will follow some kind of pattern where you have this step-by-step teaching that sometimes will issue in at the end of the letter to practical exhortations and things like that. But there's a kind of a standard form that you follow. The difference with Hebrews is it doesn't work like that. I've used the analogy that Hebrews sometimes feels like you're suddenly dropped down in the middle of a complicated city. Like I think about San
Mm,
Francisco in the United States, for instance, or even here in Vancouver. When we first moved to Vancouver, I didn't understand how the streets worked, even though it's
mm,
laid out pretty much in my part of the city, laid out in grid form. It took a while to understand the complexities of where I would turn. And so now I know that if I'm going fly fishing out in the interior, I go down 16th Street, I come to Bernard and go over to 12th, and that takes me all the way out to Highway 1, and I go out. I know what I'm doing and where I'm going in the city. It makes sense to me. Uh,
mm,
Hebrews needs some orientation, and there are various things. But for instance, one of the basics is that Hebrews is probably an ancient sermon rather than a letter. Most Hebrew scholars would think that it was some form of homily or sermon, probably the most complete one that we have from the ancient world. And one of the dynamics in a homily or sermon, just as is the case today, is there's a move from exposition to exhortation and then back to
mm,
exposition. So, for instance, if I'm preaching in a church here today, as I was yesterday, I preached on James, the book of James, chapter 3, about the tongue. And I had kind of 3 points in my sermon. And at the end of each of those points, I turned to the congregation and said, now let's think about where we are at this point.
mm,
Those of us in this church. So I turned from an explanation of the text to an
mm,
exhortation of the people in the room. And then I went
mm,
back to my next point and went with more explanation and then came back to more exhortation. And that's exactly what Hebrews does. The
mm,
main point of Hebrews is exhortation, but the grounding or the foundation of that exhortation is in the book's Christology. So the author
mm,
goes through movements in the book unpacking the Christology. He starts with exaltation and then moves to incarnation, then ordination of Christ as a high priest, and then the superior offering of Christ as a high priest. So, with the Christology itself, it moves step by step through the explanation of the person
mm,
and the ministry of Jesus. But those steps are interrupted in very strategic, powerful ways by exhortation. The Christology flows into those exhortations, and it
mm,
makes a very powerful dynamic where the author's moving back and forth. And then you get to chapter 10, verse 25, which is kind of the bracketing off of the great center section of high priesthood Christology in Hebrews. And then the whole last section of the book is various kinds of exhortation. The author giving promises, the author giving positive examples, negative examples like Esau, the wonderful examples of the people of faith in chapter 11. That sounds like exposition because he's telling us about people, but in the ancient world, that was called an example list. And the whole point of an
mm,
example list, where you give example after example after example, is exhortation. You're saying this is the right way to live. You need to choose to live this way. So I
mm.
think one of the things that we have to do is understand some of those kind of dynamics. But a good beginning place is to say, all right, this is moving back and forth between exposition about Jesus and exhortation on how we are to respond to who Jesus is and what he's accomplished for us.
Yeah. So you would say that the crux of the letter or the key themes that go through the letter is Christology. or
Well,
would you?
here's the way I would describe the key theme, if you had the kind of the center, the heart of what Hebrews is about, is that God has spoken to us through his son, our high priest, and we need to hear and respond to what God has said by enduring in the faith. Let me say that another way. I'll say that again and then I'll say it another way because it is a mouthful. But God has spoken to us by his son, who is our high priest, and he's spoken very clearly through the son, and we should respond with endurance in the faith. Here's another way that I say it is that if you summed up the message of Hebrews, it is that your perseverance in the Christian life is going to be in direct proportion to the clarity with which you see who Jesus is and what he's accomplished on our behalf. Now, this is wonderfully, wonderfully practical,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because it basically is saying that you and I will not endure in the faith through all the hard things that we experience in life. We will not endure in the faith unless we are clear about who Jesus is and have a closeness to him in that clarity and clear about the nature of the gospel. In other words, if we become fuzzy on the identity of Jesus and fuzzy on the nature of the gospel, it's going to be very hard to hang in there as Christians.
Yeah.
So that's the heart of the book.
Yeah, and it makes very, very good sense because that's what that's what we need to hold on to.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, that's a very, very neat way of explaining it. Thank you for that one. Thank you for watching this clip. If you enjoyed it, you can find another one by clicking just over here. Or if you want to watch the full episode and dive a step deeper, you can find a link in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.